I was never his wife. I was his venture capital. 3 hours ago, in the back of a town car, my husband looked at me and said I was the best investment he had ever made. Better than any stock he'd ever traded. This is how I realized my 7-year marriage was just a business acquisition. I was staring at the reflection of the gold-rimmed clock on our bedroom wall, watching the seconds tick by while Julian slept beside me, and that was when the weight of it finally crushed the air out of my lungs. It started as a faint tremor in my chest, a cold realization that the man breathing softly against the expensive linen sheets was a stranger I had funded into existence. My name is Elena, and for 7 years I believed I was the protagonist of a sweeping romance, the kind of story people envy at dinner parties, but the truth was much colder. I was never his partner, I was his venture capital, a strategic move on a board I didn't even know we were playing on. The house was silent, save for the hum of the central heating, a sound that usually made me feel safe but now felt like the white noise of a long-term deception. We were in our new home in the hills, the one I had signed for with a smile that felt permanent, believing his talk of our forever and our legacy. Julian had always been the architect of our future, or so I thought, with his grand visions and his talk of how we were building an empire of shared dreams and mutual affection. He had a way of looking at me that felt like being seen by a spotlight, intense and focused, making me feel like the center of his universe, while he quietly mapped out the terrain of my bank account and my social standing. It had happened 3 hours earlier, at a celebratory dinner for his latest promotion, a position he never would have secured without my father's quiet intervention and my own relentless networking. We were in the back of a town car, the city lights blurring into long streaks of neon against the glass, and he was high on the adrenaline of success. He had leaned back, smelling of expensive bourbon and victory, and laughed a sound that usually warmed me, but tonight felt jagged. He didn't mean to say it. He was just too comfortable, too sure of his grip on me to keep the mask tight. He had looked at his new watch, a gift from me for our anniversary, and muttered that the acquisition was finally complete, that the overhead was high but the dividends were finally paying off. When I asked him what he meant, thinking he was talking about work, he looked at me with a glazed, triumphant expression and said that I was the best investment he had ever made, far better than the stocks he'd liquidated to stay afloat before we met. The word investment hung in the air, cold and clinical, stripping away the years of whispered promises and the 3 years of IVF we had just endured. I realized in that moment that my vulnerability, my body, and my grief during those failed cycles weren't shared burdens to him. They were just operating costs in his long-term plan for a stable, high-status life. He tried to laugh it off, calling it a joke or a metaphor for how much I meant to him, but the slip of the tongue had already torn the curtain. I sat there in the dark car, watching his profile, and saw for the first time the calculation in his eyes that I had mistaken for passion for nearly a decade. By the time we got home, the silence between us was a physical barrier, though he seemed oblivious, distracted by his own ego and the ease of his ascent. I watched him undress, the man I had supported through 3 career changes, the man whose debts I had cleared when we were 25, and I felt a profound sense of shame. It wasn't shame for what he had done, but for how eagerly I had participated in my own commodification, believing every rehearsed line and every tactical touch. I had thought we were building a life based on a deep, soul-level connection, but I was just the infrastructure for his ambition, the stability that allowed him to play the role of a successful man. I stayed awake until the sun began to bleed through the curtains, casting long, pale shadows across the room we had decorated together. I thought about the way he used to hold my hand when I was crying over my mother's illness, and I wondered now if he was genuinely comforting me, or if he was simply maintaining his asset. Every memory felt tainted. Every I love you sounded like a transaction, a small payment to keep the lights on in a house he didn't own. I looked at his phone on the nightstand, buzzing with congratulatory messages from people who only knew him because of me, and I realized that the man I loved didn't exist. He was a character he had created to suit my needs, a mirror designed to reflect exactly what I wanted to see so that I would never stop investing in him. The morning light was harsh, showing the dust motes dancing in the air, And for the first time in 7 years, I didn't feel the need to wake him up with coffee or a smile. I felt a strange, hollowed-out kind of clarity. The kind that only comes when you realize the foundation of your world is made of cardboard. He had said all the right things. He had played the part of the devoted husband with such precision that I had ignored the lack of soul behind it. I wasn't his wife. I was his patron, his safety net, and the ego boost that kept him from having to face his own mediocrity. As he began to stir, stretching with the easy grace of a man who believes he has won, I realized that the investment was about to be liquidated, and for the first time I was the one holding all the shares. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden I had spent the last spring, planting the roses just beginning to bud in the early February chill. I wondered how many other women were sitting in beautiful rooms right now, realized they were just the scenery in someone else's play. He had been so careful for so long, but the arrogance of success had made him sloppy, and that one sentence had ended the game. I didn't feel like crying anymore. I just felt a quiet, simmering resolve to take back the pieces of myself I had so willingly handed over. He thought he had secured his future, but he had forgotten that an investment only has value as long as the investor chooses to stay. When he finally opened his eyes and saw me standing there, he smiled that practiced, boyish smile that used to make my heart ache, asking me why I was up so early. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the emptiness behind the charm, the way he was already calculating the schedule for the day. I didn't answer him at first. I just watched the way the sunlight hit the gold watch on his wrist, the one that marked the time of our dead relationship. I told him I was thinking about the dividends he mentioned in the car, and for a split second I saw the mask flicker, a flash of genuine fear crossing his face before he smoothed it over with a laugh. But it was too late. The transaction was over, and as I walked out of the room to start the rest of my life, I realized that the only person who had truly lost anything in this deal was the man who thought he could buy a soul. I stood in the kitchen. The marble countertops felt cold under my palms, a stark contrast to the heat of the anger beginning to pulse in my temples. Julian followed me downstairs, his footsteps heavy and confident, still trying to weave a web of explanations around the truth he had accidentally let slip. He talked about how I misunderstood him, how his choice of words was just a result of the wine, but his voice lacked the resonance of a man who was actually hurt. He was just a man trying to protect his interests, a landlord worried about losing a high-paying tenant, and every word out of his mouth felt like a further insult to my intelligence. I realized then that our entire history was documented in my bank statements and his mounting collection of luxury goods, while the emotional ledger I had been keeping was entirely one-sided. He tried to put his arms around me, reaching for that familiar physical intimacy that had always been his way of silencing my doubts, but I stepped back. The air between us felt thick, charged with the electricity of a storm that had been brewing for years, hidden behind polite smiles and expensive vacations. I asked him about the first year, about the time he cried when he thought he might lose me, and I watched his eyes. There was a flicker of hesitation, a momentary search through his internal script to find the right emotion to mimic, and that was my answer. Even his vulnerability had been a calculation, a way to bind me to him through pity and a sense of being needed, ensuring that I would never look too closely at the gaps in his story. The silence grew as he realized I wasn't going to play my part this time. I wasn't going to provide the reassurance he expected. I thought about the career I had sidelined to support his ambitions, the moves across the country, the friends I had drifted away from because they saw through him long before I did. I had been his curator, shaping him into a man who could walk into any room and command respect, never realizing I was just polishing a hollow shell. He stood there in his silk robe, looking every bit the successful man I had helped him become, and for the first time he looked pathetic to me. His power was an illusion, a house of cards built on my belief in him, and as that belief evaporated, he seemed to shrink before my eyes. I told him I wanted him to leave, not because of a single sentence in a car, but because I could no longer breathe in a house filled with the ghosts of his lies. He tried to argue, mentioning the house and the legalities, his mind immediately jumping to the division of assets, which only proved my point further. Even in the face of our marriage ending, he was thinking about the bottom line, calculating his exit strategy just as carefully as he had calculated his entry. I watched him realize that the game was truly over, the charming facade finally dropping to reveal a cold, hard pragmatism that made my skin crawl. He didn't ask for a second chance to love me. He asked how this would look to his colleagues, and what it would mean for his standing in the firm. I spent the rest of the morning watching him pack. The silence in the house now punctuated by the sound of zippers and the rustle of clothes being folded. There were no tears, no dramatic pleas, just a clinical efficiency that confirmed everything I had felt in the dark hours of the night. As he walked toward the door with his suitcases, he paused, looking back at the living room with a sense of regret that I knew was for the lifestyle, not the woman he was leaving behind. He looked at me one last time, and for a second, I saw the man I thought I loved, but the image didn't hold. It flickered and died, leaving only the stranger who had used my heart as a stepping stone. When the door finally closed, the sound echoed through the high ceilings of the foyer, a final punctuation mark on a 7-year sentence. I sat on the floor of the empty hallway, feeling the weight of the silence, and for the first time in a long time, I felt light. The investment had failed. The losses were astronomical, but the remaining capital was mine. I looked at the space where his things had been, and instead of a void, I saw a clearing. I had paid a high price for this lesson, but as the sun climbed higher in the sky, illuminating the dust and the truth of my new reality, I knew I would never let myself be a line item in someone else's budget again.